correct.
Sweet. Evening. Since there's an audience of 4, since this is interactive, guys are getting called on a lot. So I do want to this is Apologetics and Everyday Conversations. I do want to give a lot of credit to Greg Kokel, who's of Stand to Reason, who developed a lot of these ideas, and I am simply liberally borrowing them from him, but I think they're really good ideas. So I wanted to start off with a question. When we hear the word apologetics, or the word evangelism for that matter, and we can kind of use it interchangeably in this context, what do we think about? Is this apologetics? No. Well, at least in theory, no. In practice, often yes. Where it is just dumping a whole bunch of information on somebody without getting a whole lot of feedback from them. So sadly, even though we don't intend on apologetics looking like that, that's often what we get. How about this? I'm giving you easy ones first. No. Again, in theory, no. In practice, yes. A lot of times these things end up turning into arguments where 2 people spend a lot of time talking past each other. How about this? Yes. Yeah, I think the answer to this one is yes. And keeping in mind, part of it is, the reason I use this piece of clip art was not just because it's free, but also because of the common ground in the Venn diagram. Because so many times when we're having conversations with people who have different beliefs than ours, the tendency is to focus on let me tell you why you're wrong. Don't let me tell you why you're wrong. And a lot of times it can be, okay, what are the commonalities that we have that we can then use to understand our differences in their context? And we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Is this apologetics? This is probably what everybody thinks about, harvesting, closing the deal. That's kind of the mindset that everybody has. You present this brilliant argument and revival breaks out. But what about this? And this is taken because Greg Kokel loves to use the term gardening for this, that it's not always about getting somebody to completely believe the entire gospel soup to nuts in one shot. That it can be just as much to put, as Greg likes to put a stone in somebody's shoe, or in Matrix terms, putting a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. That many times what God will use is if you get somebody thinking and questioning their own worldview in a way they hadn't before. And the key to all this is questions. Again, we often think about apologetics and evangelism as us dumping a whole bunch of information on another unsuspecting or sometimes suspecting person. And that really, the focus, I think, is much more productive to have coming into this is one of asking questions, rather than just dropping a whole bunch of propositional truth. Now, there's places for propositional truth. I'm not saying that we're just about asking questions. But I think that our questions need to be our default mode. And I think as we'll see, that can then guide us as to where we go from here. But this raises an obvious question. Why questions if the gospel is an answer and not a question? Because again, ultimately we believe that, as followers of Christ, that our worldview is true like gravity is true. It's not true like, vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream, or organ meats are delicious, or, it's not a matter of taste. These are a matter of we believe these things are objective. So if that's the case, if what we're trying to communicate is gospel truth and not just, true for you and not for me, why questions? Any thoughts on why questions might be appropriate?
Worked well for Socrates.
Yes, Socrates, or Socrates is also known. But yeah, Socrates used...
It's a less confrontational manner of engaging, and it's basically you actually get engagement rather than just sort of blasting somebody.
Yep. And why does Socrates use that approach? Was it just because he didn't want to offend his students?
It's sneaky. So you essentially get people to start thinking about why they believe what they believe, and rather than you having to argue and then getting defensive, they start and having to look at the questions and answering the questions, and then if they find holes, then they're more likely to accept them and start wondering why they believe what they believe.
Exactly. as you know, it's a time gone by, and even before my time, but back when there used to be door-to-door salesmen, one of the things they would do is they would demonstrate their product for you, because it was, and basically they would demonstrate that their product, you know, it was generally something you already had, you know, a vacuum cleaner, a broom, or a Cuisinart, whatever. But what they had to do was show that their product could do things that your product couldn't. So they'd, you know, dump a whole bunch of ashes from an ashtray on the floor, and they'd have you get out your vacuum cleaner after you know, got yourself off the ceiling and tried to vacuum it up, but of course you couldn't vacuum all of it up, and then they brought the super vacuum, and then the carpet looks like it did before it's new, and that's where the sale gets made. But we need to engage people in order to get to that point and not just dump stuff on them. 4 ways of looking at it, and some of these are ones already covered. I mean, that we have to understand each other. We have to, if we don't understand the other person's perspective, how can we respond to it? How can we speak into it? And how can we know that without asking them? So many times I think we get into these, you know, these matches of throwing words at each other and not hearing each other because we don't really understand where the other one's coming from. Or, and I know this never happens on the internet, but we have straw man arguments where we think that, you know, Christians believe this, or Muslims believe that, or Hindus believe this, and we go after that thing, and the thing is a red herring, and it has nothing, it doesn't mean anything to this particular person. Another one, and I don't know if Socrates thought about this, is also that you communicate genuine love and concern for other people when you ask questions. That it's not just, I'm going to come in on my white horse and tell you the truth and you're going to like it, but it's like, but in community people, you really want to know about them. And hopefully that's our heart, that it really isn't coming in so that I can tell you how things work and buddy, you better listen to me, but that we really should want to know where people are coming from. As Rahman pointed out, it also invites people to consider the flaws in their own worldview. Because again, a lot of times in having evangelistic or apologetic conversations, you know, it comes down to the Christian presents the gospel and then spends the rest of the conversation defending all of the questions the person has. And at the end of the conversation, the other person basically thinks, oh, Christianity's got all these holes in it because this guy couldn't answer these questions. But they still assume that their own worldview is completely, you know, airtight because they weren't forced to take a closer look at it. And then finally, if we ask questions, it may, just maybe, open the door for the person to ask us questions through the building of trust, and sometimes just through, you know, through curiosity. So I think there's a lot of value in that. But of course, you know, what should drive what we do shouldn't just be, oh, this sounds good. What about Scripture? What does Scripture say about this? And especially, why ask questions if what we see in Scripture is proclamation, not questions? You know, you look at John the Baptist, and, you know, proclamation. You look at you read through Acts of the Apostles, lots and lots of proclamation, and long, proclamations going on. But when we look at the Gospels, Jesus asked a lot of questions. One's from Matthew 12, and I'm only going to give a couple examples. Then a demon-oppressed man who was blind and mute was brought to Jesus, and he healed him, so that the man spoke and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, "Can this be the son of David?" That is the Christ. But when the Pharisees heard it, he said, "It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons." Knowing their thoughts, Jesus said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. And if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand?" In other words, what's the point of engaging in self-destructive behavior by driving out your own demons? And then Jesus goes even more, more to the quick. "And if I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by who do your sons cast them out?" Now Jesus could have simply said, "I cast them out by the power of Yahweh," and ended the conversation. But saying these things forced the Pharisees to consider the flaws in their conclusion about where Jesus' ability to drive out demons came from. Another example, in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." One of our favorite passages of Scripture. "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul?" Now, when you ask those questions, it suddenly becomes a lot more immediate. Okay, this is not just some theoretical thing. This is about my eternal destiny. So it's, and Jesus uses other ways to make people think about what they believed and whether or not it made sense. But what about Matthew 10, which we're actually going to be doing this coming Sunday in our sermon series? These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and proclaim as you go, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So if we do that now, so let's go to, we can go up and down McKeldin Mall and start saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Is that going to work? Why not?
It's a very different context. For a start, a lot of people probably might not even know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And others may think that you're a fire and brimstone preacher.
Yep. Absolutely. Context is important. And when he gives the instructions beforehand, and he just gives that clue, he says, only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, they were the ones who would understand it. You say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and they will know exactly what they're talking about. But in our culture, we don't have a whole lot of context, of gospel context. So if we just start making proclamations and give people no context in which to understand them, it's going to fall on deaf ears. So then, of course, the question y'all should be thinking at this point is, okay, what kind of questions do I ask? And there's three types of questions, or three primary classes of questions, and I will go through them one by one. First one is, what do you mean by that? Definitional question. Just asking people to clarify what it is that they're talking about when they use specific words. How did you come to conclude that this is true? Now, we may ask it differently, but once we've got a really good picture of what people believe, then the next question is, why do you believe it? What was the thought process, that led you to conclude that this was the way that reality is? And then there's another group of questions which can be used to make a point, and I'll unpack those in a little bit. But those are the three primary types of questions that we use in this basic general order. So what do you mean by that? The idea behind this is to get people to define what it is they're trying to say, rather than us assuming that we know what they mean. And sometimes the conversations, you can do this in response to something someone says. Sometimes it can be in response to seeing something that they're wearing, a t-shirt or sweatshirt, or a book they're holding if you're on an airplane, and so on and so forth. So asking people what they mean by a statement either they're making verbally, or a statement that, again, their clothing, their possessions, or whatever are making. Now, you might have to ask this question multiple times to get to the point of understanding the other person, especially since, again, we have a lot of different terms and a lot of different belief systems. But that's okay. You got the other person talking, and people don't generally mind talking about themselves. Some people have, some people more than others. And again, in the process of doing this, don't assume that you know what the other person means when they use a specific word. Because there are a lot of words now that are in the vernacular that have drastically different definitions for Christians and non-Christians. Love, tolerance, justice. Those are good things, but they mean very different things depending on your subcultural context. And again, if we don't understand what the other person means by the term, we're going to have a conversation that's based on a meaning that we have that they don't have, and it's not going to be productive. So for the audience, what are some ways we can lovingly ask the question? What do you mean by that? I mean, you can just ask it that way, depending on the person. But what are other ways that we can ask that question that indicate we're not trying to put the other person on the spot, but that we really want to understand where they're coming from? Go ahead, Nathaniel.
I'm confused. Could you clarify?
That's a very good way of putting it. I'm confused. Can you clarify?
You could say, I feel like I'm missing something. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I feel like I'm missing something. I'm not sure. I want to make sure I'm tracking with you. Can you help me unpack that a little bit more? So there's a number of different ways to ask, and of course the way you ask it's also going to depend on the context. With somebody who you know really well, you could probably be a little more blunt, and with somebody who you don't know very well, you want to be a little more, cushion things a little bit more. And of course some people love full contact conversation, some don't. So part of it is understanding who your audience is. So once we've started unpacking what the other person, and it's not necessarily linear that you're going to completely unpack everything they believe and then get to the next stage, but these are the steps we want to take, is ask them, how did you come to conclude that this is true? If someone has an assertion about reality, and we understand properly what that assertion means, then the next question is, how did you come to conclude that that really reflects reality? So we're transitioning from what people believe to why they believe it. Now, when we do this can be messy, because a lot of times people have not carefully thought out their worldview. A lot of people's worldview, not everyone's, but a lot of people's worldviews are these strange hodgepodge of things that have been pulled off, Twitter and TikTok and everything else, kind of all amalgamated together into this worldview Frankenstein. And they may not have ever really thought this true before. So be patient and be gracious. Don't do things to make the other person feel dumb because they haven't thought this through. We need to be patient and need to, and sometimes reflect questions. When someone asks, it seems you're saying this, am I understanding you correctly? That reflection is always good in this. Another key part of this question is it helps us understand what's important to people. Because if we see that someone's rationale has a lot of basis in relationship or basis in power or basis in logic, that's going to help us to understand, okay, what does this person really value? What aspects are going to really speak to them? So that again, we're not talking to them in a way that's not going to mean anything to them. We can understand, and I'm not talking about manipulating. The gospel is the gospel. We present the gospel clearly. But that the way we relate to people is, the way we love people has to take into account what do they love, what do they value. And again, the only way we can know these things is by asking them questions. Now, do not use this question to fish for gotchas. It's very easy to do that, where you turn this into a chess match and you're waiting for somebody to make the wrong move and then pounce. It's very unloving to do that, and B, it is not going to be conducive to the conversation. This is not about taking people's worldviews and smashing them on the ground and laughing at them. This is inviting people, but we do want to invite people to understand and see the tensions in their beliefs. We'll talk a bit more about that in the next set of questions. But we don't want this. If people sense that we're just trying to trap them, they're not going to want to engage, and no one likes that. Again, we want to see, are we looking for these things and trying to understand? Yeah, we do want to be aware of, okay, what's coherent, what's not, what makes sense, what's not. But not in the sense that we're going to jump down their throat the minute that we find an inconsistency. So what are ways we can lovingly ask this question? How did you come to conclude that it's true? Or what are some softer ways to do it if the occasion warrants it? Yeah, that's one way to ask it. I think you'd want to have somebody who knows a little bit more to ask it quite that way. But yeah, I think one is just, can you tell me more of the story of how you came to this conclusion? That you invite them to give you a narrative, not just, especially if it's somebody who's more relational, where something could be helpful, to give a narrative rather than just, I want, I want, a bunch of bullet points, major proposition, minor proposition, and so on. So asking people to share their stories of how did you, what was your journey like to coming to conclude that, that God doesn't exist, or to conclude, that Hinduism is true, or whatever. That we can ask them, what was your journey to that, if it wasn't something you were up with. Another one can be just, can you walk me through the process of how you got to this? Can you break it down for me in a little more detail as to what are the connections to help me understand the connections of how these ideas that we're talking about fit together. And there's probably other ways. I am not the master of doing things in a gentle and quiet fashion. So, and again, depends on the relationship. But so the third is using questions to make a point. And this is where we're starting to take some of the information that they've given us and begin to evaluate it. But again, we have to start with that foundation. We must be sure we clearly understand what they believe about a particular aspect of reality and why they believe it as much as we possibly can. And then we start the process of working through them to evaluate. Again, it's not about winning an argument. It's not about gotcha. It's not about playing chess. But it's helping people in love to see flaws or inconsistencies or tensions in their worldview they might not have thought about. And sometimes they haven't. I said again, it's easy. As I tell people, I'm a big fan of writing things down because I find many times that what I think has crystal clarity in my head is a whole mass of jabberwocky when it comes out of my mouth or when it goes onto the paper. So I think this can be a very helpful exercise to really work through this. And as I mentioned too before in the vacuum cleaner salesman story, if people see flaws in their worldview, again, not in a condemnatory fashion, but just in the course of a friendly conversation, they may be more opening to hearing about ours. Whereas if we don't ever give them a reason to believe that their worldview doesn't have any issues, why would they change? You only switch from product X to product Y if you believe that product Y is better. So there's 4 basic goals of these kinds of questions, and these are questions that aren't going to have, they're not going to be as succinct maybe as the other ones in terms of having specific phraseology. One of those goals is to inform, and we'll talk about that a bit of just basically unpacking a little bit more what somebody is thinking and helping them make connections they might not otherwise. Another one can be to persuade. A third one can be to refute. Now, again, how we do this matters, but sometimes we can ask a question in a way that gently exposes an inconsistency in someone else's worldview. And then the fourth is called setting up the terms, and I'll explain that one in a minute. That's more about knowing when to, setting ground rules, as it were. So informing. Sometimes you'll be talking to somebody who has all of the pieces of a particular aspect of worldview, but they haven't put them together. So your questions will be there to help them make those connections. So let's say someone comes up to you and says they're Christian, but they don't believe that Jesus is the only way to be right with God. And there's a number of different ways to do this, but one way to do it is you can start with the question of asking them why they believe that Jesus died on the cross. Again, not in the accusatory, but in this tone, but with a tone of just help me understand what are your thoughts about this? What do you see? What do you understand to be the reason why Jesus died on the cross? Now, if they say it's for our sins, then we need to ask the question, can we atone for our sins by doing good works? And if they say yes, that it is, then it's a fair question to ask why it was necessary for Jesus to die. And Paul in Galatians 2:21 said it clearly, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. We don't hit him with that verse, but we ask him the question of if it is possible to be good enough to get in heaven, what does atonement do? And if they say no, if they say it's not possible for us to become right with God simply by doing good works, then we ask the question, what does that imply for people who haven't put their faith in Christ? Because they need atonement. And again, this isn't about laying traps for people. This is to be done in a tone where we're really trying to walk with people through this. Now, sometimes people will take offense to this because people don't like being put in situations where they don't look good. And so I can't guarantee that there's, some cases you cannot possibly be gentle enough in some cases. But, your goal here is to help people put together what they already know and to see if the way they put it together impacts the way that they think about it. Persuading is the second part. And the idea here is that when we make any kind of assertion, and sometimes you have to, the other person may go after it. And sometimes you make an assertion about a minor point, the other person goes after it, and then the entire conversation derails. So what we'd like to do when we can, not always possible, and you really got to think on your feet, is to get the other person to make the assertion for you. Because if they make the assertion for you, they're much less likely, at that point the assertion's on the table, and they're much less likely to try to take it back off again. Now what does this look like? For an example, let's say how Jesus did it in Matthew 21. What do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he went to the first and said, "Son, go work in the vineyard today." And he answered, "I will not." But afterward he changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and said the same. And he answered, "I will go, sir," but did not go. And then what's the question Jesus asked? Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They said the first. They made the assertion. Jesus didn't make it, they made the assertion. And then Jesus' response, "Truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John came in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterward change your minds and believe him." Now, I'm not saying you follow up with something that strong, but the point is, or similar also, we think about the example of Nathan with David. Nathan told a story, basically, and David was the one who made the assertion that the guy who had stolen his neighbor's lamb ought to be punished. And then Nathan at that point basically informed David that the story was about him. So again, it's not about trapping people, but that if we can get people to make the assertion for us, it makes things, at that point, it's going to be much harder for them to fight it or back down. Let's do an example more from let's do another one. Luke chapter 7. This is when Jesus was eating at the house of Simon the leper, and a sinful woman came and anointed Jesus' feet. And Simon was thinking things about the woman and Jesus that were uncharitable. And Jesus answering said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." And he said, "Say it, teacher." "A certain money lender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them will love him more?" Simon answered, "The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt." So Simon is making the assertion rather than Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "You have judged rightly." Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she had not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little." And those words to Simon would have had power in of themselves, but when he told the story of the moneylender and asked Simon to make the assertion for him, that has a completely different impact. Because again, Simon's the one the other person's making the assertion for you. They have to live with it. Let's do a more contemporary example. Suppose someone says to you they believe God forgives everyone unconditionally. I think you're in bounds to ask politely, not sarcastically, not snarkily, if they believe God should have simply forgiven Hitler. And if their answer is no, then you have common ground about the need for forgiveness that you can build on, because then at least the person is social. At least some people, shouldn't just be forgiven unconditionally, and you can start building on that. But the other person has made the assertion. Again, it's not a gotcha. It's not a checkmate. It is but there are times when we can invite the other person to make the assertion, and then we can build off that. Refuting. Sometimes somebody's worldview will show a hypocrisy or an inconsistency or incoherence or something that they're just not aware of. And a question can be helpful for pointing out to them by having them point it out. So for instance, someone says they believe that right and wrong are different for each person. Moral relativism. And if they say it's wrong to impose their beliefs on other people, you're within bounds to ask then if it's wrong for a person to impose, if it's wrong for the person to impose their beliefs on others, or if that right or wrong differs from one person to another. Is it always wrong, rather, for someone to impose their beliefs on others? Both of them cannot be true. And this is, again, you're not doing it in a way to try to gotcha people or shame them, but to gently show them that, hey, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to put these two pieces together. Can you help me? You've said this, then you said that, and it seems to me if those pieces don't fit together very well. Can you help me understand how you work through that tension? But again, charitably, we're not out to get people. And then setting up the terms. And this is just because especially in the age of Twitter and sound bites and all the rest of the stuff, people will attempt to reframe the discussion by making it about us rather than about our ideas. Now that's by using a label. You're a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're intolerant, you're whatever, you're white, you're male, you're upper class, whatever. There will be an attempt to use what's called the ad hominem fallacy, for instance, to basically say that that your opinion on something does not hold any validity because of who you are. And in instances like that, it can be very helpful to just simply ask, what does this have to do with the topic for conversation? Okay, if I'm grouchy and I dress like I popped out of a hole from 100 years ago, so what does that have to do with anything? And sometimes we just need to gently point that out. If people want to start making it about us, then we need to gently ask them, if I'm happy to engage you on this, but please help me to understand what me being this label has to do with the subject matter. Because it's really ultimately about ideas, or at least it's supposed to be. And it's so common. Most mic drops are like this, that we often don't even realize that we're committing a logical fallacy when we do this kind of thing. It happens all the time. And it's perfectly fair, again, in a charitable way, to make the other person aware of it, but if that's where the conversation is going and the person insists on going that way, there is nothing wrong with graciously bringing the conversation to an end and trusting God. There are times when you can have all the clarity and all the charity in the world, and if someone doesn't want to hear it, they don't want to hear it. And just remembering Jesus' instructions to the 12 when he sent them out in Matthew 10. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Now, it doesn't mean you quote this to them. It doesn't mean that you should cop an attitude and say, you're ignorant, unwashed masses, whatever. That's right, there's no video, so I can do hand signals. Anyway, but the point is, at the same time, it's easy, at least for some people like me who have those rescuing tendencies, to think, if we could just get the conversation going 5 more minutes, or if I can ask this question, if I can make this point, that's going to turn everything around. And there's times you just have to trust, okay, the Holy Spirit makes dead people alive, we don't. And if the conversation is clearly becoming unproductive, there's nothing wrong with just setting aside, agreeing to disagree, and moving on. Because again, these things are not a magic formula where you do that and all of a sudden revival breaks out. That is not how this works. So let's review real quick. So why questions if the gospel is an answer and not a question from what we talked about? If we're trying to tell people of the validity of a worldview that is objectively true, like universal gravitation is true, why bother with questions? Why not just dump it on them? Go ahead.
It's a way to open more hostile minds to seeing the common ground and bring a space for the Holy Spirit to work within them.
Exactly. It loves people, it invites them to let their guard down. It invites them to consider, again, the flaws in their own worldview, because so many times, again, we just drop a whole bunch of assertions on somebody and we spend the entire rest of the time playing defense. And anybody who's ever played with chess with me knows you'll beat me anytime because I only play defense. I don't play offense in chess, and so eventually the person will just pound on me. I'll make a mistake, and then it's checkmate. And so many times in evangelist conversations, we do the same thing. And questions can be really helpful for lovingly giving the other person an opportunity to think about their own beliefs and whether or not they're all they think they're cracked up to be. And then why questions if what we see in Scripture is proclamation, not questions? What do we say there? This is an actual review. I'm going to put you on the spot. In Jesus' example, again, he asked a lot of questions. And I think another one is just context, because even again in the Book of Acts, you had, in the beginning, in Peter's first couple of apologetic talks in Jerusalem, there was all this context already that they had to work with. And then you look at Paul's sermon. When Paul spoke on Mars Hill, it was a drastically different context. He said drastically different things. But the point is, firstly, we can't even understand the context of the individuals we're talking to unless we ask questions. Because otherwise we're just going to assume, all Muslims believe this, all atheists believe that, all guys believe this, all freshmen believe that, and we miss out on the opportunity to really understand people and engage them where they are. Because if we engage them where they think they are and that's not where they are, it's a waste of time. So again, the questions, the three key classes. What do you mean by that? Of asking people to understand, to as clearly as they can articulate what they believe, defining their terms. When they use the term tolerance, when they use the word protect, what do they mean by these things? Of asking again, how did you come to conclude that is true? Once we've got the what, then understanding the why. What's the chain of thoughts? And for some people, they're maybe just exploring this for the first time. But understanding what are the presuppositions underneath a lot of this thing. I mean, even a lot of political fights, a lot of times I read these things, both sides want the same thing, they just have very different ways of going about doing it. And I think in wanting the same thing, there's common ground that doesn't get explored nearly enough. And then using questions to make a point. That once, as we understand what people believe about things, what do their assertions mean, how did they come to conclude they're true, then we can ask questions again to inform, to help them put together the pieces and maybe make connections they hadn't made before. To refute, sometimes to help them see that things they thought they connected didn't really connect. To persuade, to get people to see many times that we have a commonality they didn't realize they had because they hadn't thought about it that clearly. And then the other one is Greg Krokel's terminology is setting up the terms. There are times when it is appropriate to use questions to, if someone's doing things that are just clearly not amenable to discussion, such as again going back to name calling or broad brush painting, it is within bounds in a charitable and generous way to inform people that this is the dynamic and that's not going to it's not productive and it's not really germane. So as far as resources, the ones I recommend, Questioning Evangelism by Randy Newman is a really good book. The guy, he's a Messianic Jew, so he's very much, and he went to school, he went to school as a kid, so where the rabbinic method is also very similar to the Socratic, where there's lots of questions, so he's very deeply steeped in that. So it's not questioning evangelism, I should clarify. It's not should we do evangelism or not, but it's a more of asking questions in evangelism. And that was the book that first began to turn, to make me think about this in a different light. And then actually Randy Newman, and I got to see him a number of years ago, and during his talk he mentioned a ministry called Stand to Reason, and through that I learned about another book called Tactics, which unpacks the concepts I've talked here in a lot more details, gives a lot more examples, is probably far more lucid and articulate than what I've been saying this time, but it's very, very helpful resource, and they have to do 10th anniversary edition. And for other ways to improve your critical thinking skills, Stand to Reason has an excellent website, str.org. They also have a number of classes that you can take in different topics where they're bite-sized. They're not, like you're sitting through a 5-hour-long video lecture. But if you want to know more about specific topics, the reliability of the New Testament, how do we think about abortion, and so on and so forth, they have different, and they've also got a quick reference app which has some of their video material in 2 or 3 minute bite-sized chunks also that again are very, very well done. And then YouTube, there is a channel called Red Pen Logic, which is done by one of the STR staff, where they will take things that have been put out on Twitter, well, I guess it's X now, Instagram, wherever, post, and generally things that have gotten, 5, 6, 7 digit likes, where they've really, it's not just some little unknown thing in a far corner of the interwebs, but stuff where a lot of people has resonated and then goes through with his red pen. He was a school teacher before he became a full-time apologist, and takes it and looks through it. Very educational. He's entertaining. Sometimes he's a little bit snarky for my taste, but I've also met him. Good guy, but it's just again, these videos are max 6, 7, 8 minutes, but very well done. I think he's done about 90 of them now, so you can go to the channel and just look up different topics. But it's also a really good resource because a lot of what I've learned to do has been caught in the sense of just listening to podcasts, watching these things, and just slowly assimilating how they think through things and understanding how to achieve clarity. And that clarity is helpful for us as Christians, obviously, but it's also helpful for us as we engage with non-Christians in discussions because, as the old saying goes, a mist in the pulpit is a fog in the pew. If we don't have clarity, we cannot expect the person we're engaging to have more clarity than we have. Anyway, questions about any of the material before we talk through a couple scenarios? All right, I'm going to give you a couple scenarios. It's a small enough group. Well, let's try to think of the best way to do this. Yeah, we can go ahead and there we go. Okay, what we'll do. Actually, split in 2 groups. Rama, would you be willing to take one group, and Caitlin, could you take the other? And let y'all decide how to split up among each other 50-50. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present a scenario and then ask you to spend a couple minutes talking among yourselves about what questions you might ask in response to that scenario. So I'll let you take a minute to kind of rearrange yourselves according to... So that means you two can't sit next to each other now, sorry. And these are all scenarios that actually happened to me. I wish I could say I responded brilliantly to all of them, but sadly, no.
All right. Do you want to go and join that? Okay. And then we can be a group.
All right. Scenario number 1. And so this really happened to me when, what's his name? Most of you probably have no idea who Scott Weiland is, but when he died, one of my coworkers said he felt, because he was about the same age as Scott Weiland, as Weiland was, and he said that he felt that he beat him out by living longer than he did. What questions might you ask in response to a statement like that? So in other words, this celebrity who's about the same age as me just dropped dead in his case because he had a pharmacy in his veins, and this friend of mine saying, I beat him out, I lived longer than he did. What are questions you might ask in response to that statement? I didn't say I was giving you easy ones.
You chose a nice easy one to start with.
I want to choose real ones. No one gives me easy ones, man. No one ever gives me easy ones. Again, think about the types of questions. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to conclude? And focus on the first two. What do you mean by, the kind of what do you mean by that? But again, don't just generic, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by what particular part of it? Or, how did you come to conclude that's true?
To me, this feels like there's a strong element of looking down and judgment going on here. So, why do they feel like they have it right? I mean, there's another questions I would ask, but the questions that go into my head is okay, why do you think this is, why do you feel like you need to be better than this person in the first place?
Cool.
I feel why are you making this into a victory? Why do you feel it's a competition? So I suppose the question But I'm not thinking about it as like, you know, so I don't think that's overly aggressive. That's a question. Maybe. I don't know what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think so too. So it feels like the way to respond is the way, in a sense that is still lighthearted. Like, I don't think that he's literally being really about it.
Well, the thing is, though, with a joke, there's always a grain of truth in that. So the question is it like that's what makes it, you know, that's what makes it funny. And the question is, you know, like, why is this funny? And what is, what is the nugget, the truth of the heart of this, which is why condescension seems to be at the heart of this, even if he's not conscious or aware, and they're making a joke out of it.
I wondered if it meant more like that it sort of seems to show that the length of your life is the competition, like sort of how he puts it.
So yeah, that's what the other one is like, so you could say, so what makes, so is a good life a long life?
Or, yeah.
But you were saying about responding lightheartedly, which I think is a good idea. So, but how would you, what would be a good way to do that?
Well, I think that's what makes a good life is a much more positive view, like leads to more positive responses from the person than asking about you maybe you're placed against other people. Then you can just talk about what you think, like what they consider to be a good life, and that seems like that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, so I would, as I was saying, my thoughts at the beginning were not what I would actually say to a person. And it's just like, where's this coming? This is like what's running through my head. Like, where's this person coming from with this? But no, unless I knew the person very well, in which if I did, then I might be more blunt. But yeah, I think you're right. Like, that's so much more lighthearted and open question. And open questions. That's the other thing as well. Like, you want to have open questions, not closed questions, so that it gets more discussion out, I think.
So, what do you think about that?
My second cousin
So I suppose in some ways the question, you know, is saying, is a good life a long life, and what makes a good life? Are the questions that serve both of those purposes, I think.
And I'm literally here because I don't know how to do this. So, what do you guys think? What do you think?
I mean, I really like these answers, and I mean, I have had some experience of dealing with stuff like this, just talking about airports and things. It's amazing what if someone's stuck next to you in a plane as well, and they can't get away. Obviously, that's not just me that you're not gracious when you talk to them.
All right, what do we got? And there is no right answer to this. I'm not grading you guys or anything, so don't, it's...
So we sort of came to the conclusion, we had like two questions that we thought we would follow this up with, which was, so is a good life a long life? Mm-hmm. And what makes a good life? Because those are both fairly positive questions, and they're not implying judgment. They're open questions, so they lead to a lot more conversation and a lot more discussion. Anyone else wants to add to that?
Yeah, I think those are very good questions. We don't think? Again, we're not grading these. This is to get you thinking about it. This is not to come up with the perfect question, because the questions are as individual as people are.
Ours was more be cautious about how you phrase the question, depending upon who your audience is as well. Because I was giving an example of your somewhat similar situation, and I ended up with this person's entire medical history by accident. And a complete stranger too, and it was just like, okay, not the intent, but if they were open to discuss, okay. But it really may depend upon how you proceed with, yes, asking about life in general, just healthy life or just life in general. What is their definition of health and what's their definition of, like, okay, you have come this far in their definition and in their eyes, but the very vague and open and that kind of leads into, like, please tell more. What do you mean by that?
Yep. Al Pensman, this is somebody with whom I could be really, really blunt. We've known each other for a long time, and we've locked horns in meetings before, which is kind of interesting. We get to argue with each other in the middle of a meeting, and everybody else is kind of like, it's like, don't worry, this is how we roll. But this is one where actually I got so flat-footed that I did not come up with a good response to it, and I hadn't done nearly as much with apologetics. I hadn't even gotten really started in apologetics yet. But for him specifically, I would have asked him flat out, like, what, do you think this life is all there is? Do you think this is the whole, that the time here is the whole enchilada? And then depending on what his answer is, then it's more, then the question is, okay, how do what brought you to conclude that either it is or that it's not? And if you think that it's not, if this life isn't what there is, what do you think happens after that? Like I said, there isn't a single right question. The purpose of the exercise is just to get y'all thinking about, because a lot of times, like for me, I don't think on my feet very well, and I do a lot better when I've had time to think through these things. Of course, you can't, you don't get, life does not come with dress rehearsals. So even having the practice of thinking of, okay, sometimes I like to, call film studies, going through a conversation like, okay, if I had this to do over again, what are ways I could have responded differently? Not to beat yourself up because you didn't respond that way, but a sense of, okay, just getting yourself to even think in those terms can be really helpful. Second one, and I did not respond well when this one got dropped on me at work. Coworker comments that all religions were started by people who were out to make money. What questions might you ask in response?
Money might not have existed.
And I said, full disclosure, I answered this question with a statement, and the statement that I responded with completely shut the conversation. Well, actually, it was a question. The way the question was worded completely shut down the conversation. Full disclosure.
Honestly, this feels like it comes from somewhere, and I'm like, have you had a bad experience? Like, this doesn't sound like you just came out of nowhere. It's a logical thing. It doesn't
Yes.
they consider that like cultures, something that happened to them, or some injustices they see, or things like that. Maybe we could talk about injustice as a concept.
Personally, my opinion goes to questions that make sense. I guess, like, for example, the church does a lot of charity work, hospitals and stuff. Do you really think the church is seeing a profit from something or business or something? But this is good to start with. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to conclude that? I think those, yeah, I mean, I agree. That's a good question, but you're sort of sidestepping and getting to the heart of the matter. I mean, another way of doing that is if you sort of think about religious leaders, like Jesus, for instance, who lived and died in poverty. And so the question is like, okay, well, what about successful religious leaders who lived and died in poverty and never made a dime, and actively preached against making money around all things, so essential for all things? Because you can say, I mean, you can certainly say it, and you could also start off with that by saying, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of charlatans out there who use religion to make money. I can certainly agree with you on that. But is it really fair to tar everyone with the same brush? and say, and then you can cite examples of Veritas, because I mean, obviously it's not just Jesus. You could talk about Buddha would be another example, because he basically he started off rich and then gave it all up. So, but I wonder if it was me, if I would maybe start with something like that and then follow up with your question. But I really like your question, because you're right, it just cuts right in. And I don't think it's quite a gentle question. It's not a mean question. Any other thoughts, Brandon?
Statistics,
Yeah, like you said, never
it's like a bad
tarring a broad brush or something. I don't know.
Tarring with the same brush.
Like, maybe ask them to specify all religion is a pretty broad statement. Could ask them, like, what do you mean? Is there any religion in particular that you know?
Can this person provide an
I guess it goes back to, do you have, like what Kelly asked, is there an issue maybe that you have your personal life religion? This is
Okay, pencils down. Thoughts? What do y'all come up with? I'll pick on this side of the room since the other side of the room started last time. Thanks, Caitlin.
So we got 2 discussions going on here. Want to say yours first?
Sure. Well, one thing you could go into is, specific examples. What about people who gave all that they owned in the starting eras of these religions, so the Christian martyrs, for instance?
Yeah.
And then the second one was this more of a guiding discussion, open discussion of, like, can you provide an example?
Mm-hmm.
You claim all, but then it kind of makes us wonder, okay, this person witnessed or experienced something to make this claim. It's like, oh, can you provide an example? Or like, clarify. And then kind of go into the all.
Yep.
Fallacy, as we were discussing fallacies over here. So,
Thoughts?
So one of our responses was similar. So we basically said, is it really true to tar everybody with the same brush? Is it really the case? So actually, no, sorry, let me rephrase it. I would say, yes, I agree with you that there are a lot of religious leaders who are charlatans and who are basically use religion to make profit and make money. But is it really true to tar everybody with the same brush? Especially when you have notable examples of religious founders who lived and died in poverty, or who started rich and then gave them. And so, for instance, you have Jesus, who lived and died in poverty. He never made any money. Or you have Buddha, who started off as a prince and then gave it all away and gave it all up. So, I mean, there are 2 examples already which would question that. So, what do you mean when you say all? Is that a really fair statement to ask? And then Kelly also had a really good question, which sort of actually cuts through the discussion. So,
just sort of, without saying so, that just sort of noticing this is kind of a hostile, like, out of nowhere thing to say, and so ask more like, are you okay? Like, did something happen to you? Like what is this coming from? Like literally asking about their experience with religion and how they view it in that sense, because it doesn't sound like something that somebody says because they're using their logic.
And that is, in this instance, that is correct. And I think, one of the things we do need to be careful about in engaging this is to not let it devolve into a situation of, there's some, with all versus some, if we can get into conversations about that, but then we can also miss the heart of the person who's there in the midst of all of that.
What happened?
Right.
No.
Oh.
I'm asking you.
Oh, this is one I did not handle this well. I mean, I did ask a question, but there was an edge in my voice, and basically said, the vast majority of Jesus' followers died penniless as martyrs. Like, how does that square with the assertion you just made about the origin of religion? And he didn't have a response to that. And part of it is like, I was really stressed out and I did not handle it well. And there's times when the edge in your voice kind of indicates that you're asking a question and you want to drop the mic at that point. That was not one of my better moments. I will open, full disclosure on that. And he's someone who really, I mean, he grew up Catholic. He's had some kind of really bad experiences growing up. I don't know all the details of it. But he also has quite the temper, so it's also one of those things of trying to figure out, like, how far can we even get into a conversation like this without you speeding up and things becoming unproductive. But yeah, getting underneath, and again, it's something to think about thinking charitably about people. I mean, people are sinners. We're all sinners, of course. But just understand that sometimes people make these assertions out of pain and not necessarily because they're just that brilliant. They figured things out that we haven't figured out. Like, we are talking to other human beings. That we believe what we believe in part because we want it to be true. And knowing why we want it to be true can often open the doors to understanding our innermost desires. I mean, I think a lot of atheism comes out of not wanting God to be true because the vision of God is someone who is very different than who he actually is. It is 8:05. I do want to honor the time. I'll give you this one as take home. But we don't have to discuss it now, but take this one home and think about it. When discussing faith with family members, she responds that she believes in God, but not in organized religion. What questions might you ask in response? I think this one to kind of take home, discuss, on the way. But this is another, and this one is one that comes up a lot. And even you see Christians who kind of like, I like Jesus, I hate his, I don't like the church. And I was actually reading with Casimir last night. We're reading through. We can cut the mic whenever. I'm just going to tell stories because I'm old and I do that. But Casimir are going through Natasha Crane's 30 questions. Talking with your kids about Jesus. And the chapter we're on right now the section we're on is just Jesus teaching on various topics, including unpopular ones like hell. But the one on this one is his topic, teaching about religion, because there are a lot of times people try to portray Jesus as this iconoclast who basically just, was anti-religious, and that's why he spent so much time locking horns with the Pharisees. And so the chapter then looks underneath the hood and says, okay, what's the actual context of these interactions with the Pharisees? And you find that no, Jesus was an observant Jew who said straight out he was not going to, he had not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it. So the narrative of Jesus is just this anti-religious iconoclast doesn't fit in with the scriptural record. Jesus was in fact, and what the problem was with the Pharisees wasn't religion writ large. It was that they had taken the law, which was good, and encrusted all of these accretions on top of it, and turned it into something that was there for their own self-fulfillment rather than as a way of getting closer to God. And so part of the chapter is we need making that distinction and not just doing this broad brush of Jesus was anti-religion. I have no idea why I told that story. Oh, because it relates to this question. That's why. It's okay. That'll get edited out. But any other questions before we close? Thank you all for coming. To quote the airlines, we know you could have spent your evening doing a whole bunch of other things. I'm glad you came. And thank you, Raman, as always, for the audio setup and for the video edit.